Hello, today we're going to sketch cosmos flowers in a loose watercolor and ink technique. The reference picture that I used is from Unsplash. I will share the link to the reference picture in my description. So let's start off with a very rough and light pencil sketch, and just to get the basic shape of the flower. So I've drawn an oval shape, marked out the center of the flower. Maybe add a few petals just to show the direction of the petals, so it acts as a guidance when I start painting. Next, we're going to move into using watercolors, and I'm going to start off with a very light watery wash, and the pigment that I've used here is Mauve. So I'm starting off with the central part of the flower, just around the center where the mauve is, and you can see from the reference picture that it is a little bit darker compared to the edges of the flowers, which has a highlight. So that bit I'm going to add later on, but now I'm just blocking the color out. So just painting the darker areas. I can use the tip of the brush to later add on some lines to depict the petals. As I'm working my way to the bottom of the flower, I can see that the petals are a bit more defined. So instead of using one huge block of color, I'm going to try and paint some petals. So just using the tip of my brush just to create the petal shape, those long shapes. Keeping my brush strokes very loose and quick. Not really defining or getting the petal shape exactly as it is, but just creating the impression. And you can see my watercolor wash is quite light at this stage. It's quite watery, which means I have less pigment and more water. For the center of the flower, I'm going to use a bright Winsor yellow. You can even use lemon yellow if you do not have the right pigment. Any bright yellow basically should do the trick. So I'm getting that again, very light watercolor wash. Not a lot of pigment there. You can see it's quite watery, and I am deliberately letting it bleed into the mauve color as well. So creating a very loose splash of color. So now I've marked out the petals and everything, and the next step is for me to add some pen, but I'd like this watercolor wash to dry first. Meanwhile, let's try and sketch another flower. The second flower in the reference picture is slightly different to the one that we just sketched. The petals are all angling a little bit upwards, so it looks more like an open, wide bowl. So I'm just getting the basic shapes using the pencil. That is my first step, and just getting a little impression of the petals. So I'm trying to deliberately sketch it angling upwards, just like how I can see in the picture. So this will act as a guidance for me when I start painting. And now let's move on to giving the first wash with the pigment Mauve. So blocking off the color in the central part of the flower, which is definitely darker compared to the outside of those petals. And then I can use the tip of my brush to just show the shape of the petals, thereby immediately giving a sense of highlight on the petals. So I'm going to leave that unpainted with just the outline. Now working my way around those petals, just being extra careful because there are a few petals angling upwards, which means the central part is not that easily visible. So I'm just giving the impression, creating those petals angling upwards. And now for the center of the flower, which again I'm using Winsor yellow, or you can use lemon yellow as well. Very light wash, and also trying to leave some white unpainted areas for highlights. And the first wash is done for this flower as well. Now let's go back to the first flower, just making sure that it's completely dry. Once the first wash is completely dry, I'm going to start using a pen now. The pen that I'm using here is a fountain pen with extra fine nib, and it's filled with sketch ink, which is waterproof, which means if I want to go over it with some watercolor, the lines would not smudge. So starting off with the center of the first flower, adding a few dots to show texture. Next, I'm going to sketch some petals, and I'm going to keep my lines really quick and dynamic, not really concentrating on contouring, but just giving the sketch an extra value, some depth and some dimension. So you can see my pen lines are very sketchy. The pen is moving really fast, and I'm holding the pen well away from the nib. So this way I am not concentrating too much on creating neat lines, but I'm creating quite characteristic lines. So let's continue to add some value to the petals, and now is the time where you can add the darkest part of the flower as well. So as you can see, some areas I have darkened it with the pen, especially the central part, which is quite dark. I've made the line a bit thicker, sometimes a little bit scribbly. So that is how you can add depth or value to the petals. So now the petals are slowly taking shape. You can see the darker areas, the angle of the petal, everything is slowly becoming clear with the lines. So this part of the flower is a little bit tricky because there are some petals that are angling upwards, and there's a second layer of petals underneath. So I'm just being very careful when I'm adding all those details. Pen is a great way to add details because that way you don't need to worry too much about having a good brush control, or if you did not want a very loose style for the finest details, then pen is a great way of adding details and adding a little bit more contour to the sketch that you're doing. That again is a personal choice. I do sometimes like keeping my sketches loose, and at that time I don't usually use the pen. But for this one, I quite like the way the pen gives a little bit more character and shape to the flower. So there's a second layer of petals underneath, so that is definitely going to be slightly more darker compared to the petals on top, so I am allowed to add a little bit more darker lines, just darkening those areas, giving it that little shadow. Now that I've done the pen lines, I'm now going back into watercolor. This time my wash will not be as watery as it was in the first. I'm going to go in with some deeper pigment, so the same mauve pigment I'm going to use, but this time with less water, a little bit more pigment, so the second layer will be a little bit more brighter and more vibrant than this very light wash we have here. Again, we are sticking to the same principle of adding deeper color to the areas where there is deeper tones in the picture, and the highlighted areas or the unpainted areas will remain as it is. So I'm starting off with the darkest of areas. You can see that I'm using a lot more of the tip of the brush, creating a little bit of lines and character using the tip of my brush. Now to soften these dark lines, I'm going to dip my brush in a little bit of water and then just run it over the darker lines, and you can see how the pigment is softening at the edge. I'm also going to add a little bit of splatter, creating a more loose outcome. Now let's continue on and do the same thing to the next half of the flower as well. So starting off with some deeper pigments of mauve. You can try your brush strokes in different ways, little dots, dashes using the tip of your brush, and in some areas using a little bit more water to sort of dilute and get a more feathery, a soft outcome for your flowers. And finally, just to give that extra pop of color in the center of the flower, I'm going to use a little bit of ultramarine blue mixed with mauve and just add it in the center, just outside the yellow of the flower. And that gives the whole flower a little bit more 3D look, because I have just added the darkest part of the flower, highlighting the rest of the flower. Next I'm going to add some green leaves, and I'm going to mix a little bit of olive green and a tiny bit of ultramarine blue, and let's pull out a few leaves, rough shape of the leaves, starting off with the tip of my brush, and then I can use the whole body of the brush, bring it all the way down and back up to create a nice leaf shape. Let's do another one. And also, just to create more loose outcome, you can splatter some color. And now we need a stem. For the stem, you can use the same green. You can mix it with a bit more water to dilute it. And with the tip of my brush, one quick movement down. And finally, adding some more depth and character to that stem, using the tip of my brush, using very deep green. I'm going to add some dots, a little bit of line, just to give it more value and more depth. And now for the center of the flower, I'm going to use a tiny bit of mauve with the yellow that I have been using, which is Windsor yellow, and I get this very dull shadow color, which I can add onto the yellow just to give that area a little bit more value. And now I'm done with the first flower. And let's move on to the next flower in a similar fashion. We're going to complete it using pen and a little bit more watercolor.